Amar, thank you for taking this opportunity to speak to you about climate finance. It's a very major issue. Were you at COP28?
Yes, I was very much at COP28. Indeed, we produced a report on climate finance for COP28 at the request of COP28. So that was one of the major contributions we made to COP28.
And how do you think it was received, and what do you think of the possibilities of its implementation?
So our central message is we are falling behind in climate action, especially in the developing world, because we are not investing enough in the low carbon economy and we are not investing enough in adaptation and resilience. So the opportunity and the challenge is ramping up investment, especially in green clean energy transition, in adaptation, resilience, and in natural capital. And what we set out in that is the magnitudes of the investment that have to be made and how that investment can be both be implemented but also financed. And in that,
Financing is a crucial thing.
yes, financing, absolutely. So on the financing, we have been stuck for a long time in this 100 billion myth. I should call it a myth because the developed countries did not really deliver on the 100 billion, in a real sense. And at the same time, we know that we need multiples of that. We argue that we need something like 2.4 trillion by 2030 if we want to meet the climate goals.
Somebody said $6 to $7 trillion by
No,
2030.
6 to 7 trillion for people are very loose with the numbers.
Right, yeah.
Our numbers are rigorous.
Very good.
They are based country by country, but also these areas that I mentioned. And at the moment, the best way to put it is we are spending about 400 to 500 billion in these areas that I mentioned, but we need to be spending, 5 to 6 times.
Tell me, there was this issue about loss and damage fund which was settled at COP28. Do you think does it look promising?
I would. It was launched at COP28, and after many years, at least there was an agreement to set up this fund. But the fund, you know, needs, to be credible, it needs, hundreds of billions of dollars. They mobilized $1 billion at COP28. So yes, they established it, but it's a case of COP,
Right.
99%.
What I've gathered, even US contributed something like $37 million
Yes.
to the fund. I mean, which was not even peanuts.
It's peanuts, but the US for the longest time refused to even agree to this term loss and damage.
Okay.
So in a sense, we move always in
Okay.
these
So
steps.
there was a
Yeah. So the big thing is there's a recognition. Those of us who work in this area will point to the yawning gap that has to be filled, and hopefully that will mobilize people into then coming up with money. And a very big part of the agenda right now is where is that money going to come from?
that is what I would like to come to. The campaign that we have launched, and including with you serving as one of our advisors in this particular campaign, is how do we create a fund of funds from non-government sources, like Tobin tax,
Yes,
etc.,
exactly.
etc., and which can then be administered by an international body, duly elected from the UN members, and administered by the World Bank once the international body is in place. So that is a corollary question which people ask.
There are so you're absolutely right. What we need is additional funding.
Right.
We need adequate funding, and we need predictable funding, because and we need mechanisms to mobilize and mechanisms to allocate. So there are three initiatives that are on the table. The first is SDR recycling, including through the multilateral development banks, which is a low-hanging fruit, but it won't generate huge amounts of money. Second, we have carbon markets, which can generate significant monies, especially during the transition. The third one, which is a very promising one, is along the lines that you were talking about, international taxation. So there was an initiative that was launched at 2028 by President Macron of France, President Ruto of Kenya, and Prime Minister Motley of Barbados to set up a task force on international taxation. And that task force will be co-led by Laurence Toubiana, but also some others. And there's a scientific advisory board. I'm on that scientific advisory board. And the aim of this task force is to come up indeed with these options. So what are some of the promising options? And I'm just mentioning them at this stage, not in political terms, but as you know, as people with ideas like the ones you were mentioning. So one is taxing the maritime sector, which doesn't pay any kind of taxes really on fossil fuels, and it uses a lot. So it's fair that they should be charged for that. And small amounts can generate large revenue. It's a very big sector. Second is the aviation industry, one of the most polluting industries. They pay taxes, but not on the carbon they use. So again, another potential source. A third is financial transactions. You could tax them, and very small amounts generate large amounts of money because the turnover is very high. Many people have argued that this would be distortion and the like. Joe Stiglitz and I wrote about it many years ago, and we argued that no, it's a perfectly good tax to be had. And a final one, which President Lula of Brazil is pushing very hard, is some kind of a fair tax on the very.
Lula has taken up under his G20 Brazil banner the whole issue about hunger and food security, and particularly the poor. He started this how do you help people to combat poverty, and there I suppose his climate agenda also is a part of it.
Yes, he's putting emphasis on two things. One, poverty, but also inequality.
Yeah.
And the second is on climate. And he has two task forces that he has set up on that. I'm associated with one of them, the one on climate. He's also pushing a lot on the reform of the climate finance architecture. He's pushing a lot on the reform of the multilateral development banks. And indeed, the Indian G20 agenda on MDB reform will probably get a lot of traction and actually practical implementation during the Brazilian G20 presidency. I was there last week, and I'm really quite impressed with the Brazilian G20 presidency.
Thank you very much. That was excellent.
Welcome.